Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, most merciful, ever merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. Brothers, sisters, respected viewers, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh, and welcome once again to our series, Life, the Islamic Answer. As you will remember, we were discussing the role of the family in the community of knowledge. And we said that this discussion is not about detailing Islamic teachings about the family in general in Islam, nor about, perhaps more specifically, the Islamic teachings around upbringing and child rearing and the rights of children in Islam and the relationship between husband and wife and so on and so forth. All of this, inshallah, as we said, we plan to dedicate a theme later in the Life series, just as we have dedicated a theme to knowledge and reason in Islam. Inshallah, we will be dedicating a theme specifically to the family, given its importance and its central role in Islamic teachings in general, in an Islamic community and an Islamic society. The idea here is simply that we wanted to highlight the necessary role or the crucial role of the family to build the community of knowledge or communities of knowledge, and that one of the key ingredients to a community of knowledge is the family. And that if, or given the productive role of the family, a community has a lot more probability to be able to achieve within that community, specifically a community of knowledge. And if there is a lack of the family support, then that probability decreases significantly. Of course, never to say that it becomes impossible to create these communities of knowledge, only that it takes much longer and there are many more hurdles and many more obstacles and difficulties to overcome if there is no support at the family level, at the infrastructure level of the community. Part of what we tried to discuss the last time that we met is to understand that before we can talk about generally Islamic teachings related to the family and how this can help us better understand the role of the family for communities of knowledge, we need to understand that the family is going through a crisis in the modern world. And this has been going on progressively over perhaps more than 2 centuries now, with much more significant decline in the structure of the family and the cohesiveness and the identity of the family in the traditional sense. And we called this the crisis of the family or the war against the family. And we explained a number of different factors, some of the main factors contributing to this crisis of the family in modern times. All of this to set the stage to understand that we cannot simply talk in abstract terms or in purely theoretical terms about what Islam may have to say about the family or its role for communities of knowledge without keeping in mind what is going on in the world and how this family is going to fit into a greater society that is undergoing these types of social changes and cultural changes and changes in values and in ideology and in worldview. And we talked about many of these dimensions or these perspectives the last time that we met. And if we wanted to go in depth, then this would be a much lengthier discussion, and we're not planning to do this at this point in the series. But I think we covered enough to show that the family unit is in crisis and that we cannot ignore this crisis. And this gives us more reason, more of a driver to spend a bit more time on this factor and this ingredient in communities of knowledge. As we said earlier, there are situations in which we're talking about the specific roles played by entities in a community because Islam has emphasized that role in a community of knowledge. And in other cases, we may talk about these because of their relevance. In the case of the family, the case is that it is both. Our religion and its teachings has emphasized the role of the family in general. And for that alone, we should be looking at the role of the family specifically in communities of knowledge. And in addition to that, it should be of the utmost relevance to us in today's world to think about and to study and to examine the role of the family in communities of knowledge, given the social context, given its relevance in our day-to-day lives. All of that to say that in order to produce communities of knowledge, we said that there is a need from the community, and perhaps one of the easiest ways for us, or simplest and most intuitive ways to present this information, can start by looking at how the family produces individuals because they stem from these families, because they come from this familial background, are going to be inclined, these individuals are going to be inclined, they will want to participate in these communities of knowledge and contribute to them one way or another, as we have described. This is going to start much sooner, much earlier in their lives, in the lives of these individuals. There should be a lot more willingness. It will become a lot more familiar for them. And this can actually create communities that can build on generational success over time, as opposed to every time starting from scratch with separate, distinct, autonomous individuals coming into this, and the efforts are lost because it is not passed down generationally, and there is no building up of the maturity level of that community of knowledge. And the easiest way to do that is through the families. These individuals will start by coming together, building a community of knowledge, and eventually they start to ensure that the values and the teachings of Islam as it pertains to communities of knowledge are passed down through their own families. And this accelerates the process of the maturity and the progression and the evolution of the community of knowledge much faster than simply waiting for that community to happen by itself on its own, or through isolated efforts from individuals without the family support behind them. And so this leads us to talk about, or focus on, we don't want to only talk about the progression of the human being in the stages of development starting from childhood. But this becomes an easier way, a more intuitive and logical way to look at what Islam has to say about the family. We can do this in multiple ways. We can look at specific dimensions of the human being. We can look at themes in the life of a human being. Or we can look at simply the chronological, biological, developmental aspect of a human being in their life, starting with childhood and even before. And so it becomes a logical point, logical starting point to ask the question, or to start looking at this entire topic of the role of the family in a community of knowledge from questions related to, or a reading of the landscape of parenting. In today's world, given everything that we have said until now, and this directly affects the discussion on Islamic communities of knowledge, if you were to talk to Muslim parents, believing parents of children, there are very common traits, very common issues, problems, concerns that keep getting raised. And many of these have appeared in the past, depending on the different circumstances of societies. But these are very clear and obvious and almost a matter of consensus and unanimity today, that parents will generally, for instance, complain or raise as an issue the loss of an Islamic identity in the children that they are raising. Or they will talk about how they feel like the children that they are raising are being brought up and coming into this world with a different set of values than their own set of values, which usually they consider to be the Islamic values. They will talk about perhaps the lack of manners and the lack of respect, which perhaps stems out of having different sets of values, but it goes way beyond, because this can stem out of the general way of conducting yourself in a society. And these discussions about manners and etiquettes are the outward version of an inward discussion that also has to do with how you carry yourself internally, yourself and how you view yourself and your identity within yourself and for yourself, your perception of yourself. And then there is the discussion or the issues raised around the disconnected world, the disconnected social reality, the disconnected reality of the family in today's world, where the parents don't feel like they are establishing genuine, deep, meaningful connections, relationships with their children. And in a lot of cases where it is felt that the next generation is closer to others, and those others could take different shapes and forms, can be different types of individuals than they are to their own family members, for instance. They are closer, to use a simple example, they are closer to their friends than they are to their parents, for instance. These are some of the very unanimous issues that keep being raised if anyone were to survey parents in general in Islamic communities. There are others, but these are things that are repeatedly and recurrently appearing. And in addition to that, and a lot of this stems from the discussion that we already had, the social reality that we described, parenting in today's world has to take into account different challenges and different difficulties that perhaps did not exist or did not exist in this way or to this extent or with these qualifiers of the technological aspect and the acceleration that it creates and the manner in which it affects the psyche of a human being and how easy or much more easily it becomes to influence someone, to overtake how they think and their daily habits and their time management and. Technology has an impact on all of this now. So on one side, there are issues related to the information overload. It's not always the case that there's simply no information. There are areas where we do really feel that there is a lack of information. There's a lack of research. There's a lack of close examination of some of the issues, serious examination from a novel perspective that really addresses the realities. We can't just repackage the same solutions and the same ways of addressing challenges if the challenge is new or new enough that it requires a fresh perspective and a new way of being looked at. And this is where the deeper intellectual examination is required. This is where we need more expertise and people who dedicate themselves to the issue until they resolve it or at least are able to present novel, creative solutions to it. So that's definitely an issue. There's a reality that in today's world, many have worded it this way. It's not that there is a lack of communication. In fact, there may be too much communication. Too much communication is happening, but no meaningful connections resulting out of this overload of communication. There's constant communication, but it is very superficial. It doesn't carry any meaning. It has no real impact, or it's not impactful in the way that we want it to be, and so it lacks depth and it lacks meaning. We talked about the issues related to what is modern and modern times and a modern ideology, and the liquidity or the fluidity of what is modern in today's world, affecting everything, creating a lack of stability, even inwardly, so that the individual is no longer sure who they are and what their values are and what they're supposed to be. And there is a general skepticism towards truth and towards knowledge. And the plurality of today's societies does not help. So you live in a world where there is so much diversity, so many different points of views, so many people with different ways of seeing the world. And all of them, unless you're coming from a place where you have done your own research and reached your own conclusions and you know where you stand, in a lot of cases you might be approaching these issues simply because of the way you were initially raised, and it looks like it's just blind following until you're confronted to this diversity and this plurality, and this in itself makes you question. And then there's, generally speaking, culturally speaking, there is an aversion to speaking of the truth in today's world, and this is part of the modern ideology, that there's no longer a truth. It's not the truth. If there is any mention of a truth, it's extremely in relative terms, so that there is your truth and mine. And these could be completely opposed to each other, completely different from each other. And in addition to all of this, we add the fact that, and this is perhaps in certain ways another symptom of modern times, the way of living a lifestyle that is disconnected from the natural order. The natural order itself constantly teaches human being about phenomena, about natural cycles, about ways of being, understanding yourself, understanding other beings, understanding general cycles of the world and of nature, without anyone having to explain those to you, because you're close to nature and you see it. You see the seasons change. You see how animals interact with each other. You see how crops grow, the work that is required. You see how nature works, and the human being then becomes a part of that nature. Today we're disconnected from nature. All of that instinctive or natural way of learning has disappeared. If it exists, it's because you have to go out of your way to recreate it. You have to find ways to get to that type of information, and the experience is still going to be different, because that's not the natural way of learning and growing up and each one of these points would deserve much lengthier discussions. We're simply covering them very quickly to highlight and really try to explain a little bit better what we mean by this general context in which the family is trying to establish itself and grow. And a lot of this used to exist before, and a lot of this made it a lot easier, simpler in previous times for what is today called the traditional family or traditional societies. A lot of these things as challenges did not exist, and the lifestyle, the closeness to nature, and so on and so forth allowed a lot of this to be overcome much more easily. Life in general was a lot simpler. This has repercussions on pretty much all dimensions of life. I won't go into a lengthier discussion on this. Life was at a slower pace, which also has all sorts of repercussions. And this includes family life, and this includes parenting. There were much greater connections in human communities, and there was a greater reliance on others in that community. People knew each other, and in a lot of ways, this created or brought about a greater level of care. Those who care about you, who may provide a bit of an oversight, who care about your well-being, generally speaking, in those communities, went beyond your direct family members. You might have neighbors, even the butcher down the street, you know them and they know you. And the people who attend the church, you know them and they know you. As families, perhaps generationally, you know them and you know their parents and you know their grandparents, and when they grow up, you know their families and their children. And this creates a different type of caring about the well-being of others in that type of community, because there's a lot more closeness as opposed to the impersonal relationships that we have in today's much more individualistic societies. There was a lot more proximity with extended families, extended family members, that when you got married, for instance, one way or another, on one side of the family or the other, and sometimes on both, you didn't go very far. You didn't leave that family behind to go get married, as is often the case today. You stayed perhaps in the same house, not just the same household and as part of the same family. You stayed in the same house, or at least in the same neighborhood. You contributed to a family business. You were part of general day-to-day family life. And many have talked about, for instance, today, the importance for children when they grow up, because it is that meaningful or impactful, the importance for children when they grow up to be exposed, for instance, or have in their lives grandparents. Because this teaches you that there are other people in this world that you should care about. For instance, there may be people who are elderly or sick in the family. And the more people you bring in into an extended family, the more of these cases will happen. And the children grow up, and it becomes a world in which it is normal for them to grow up knowing that you have to make some sacrifices in life, that there are other people that you have to take care of, that it's not just about me and myself, that everybody has to simply see that I'm important and this does not fit into my schedule or my priorities for the day, that there are other people that you want to care about because they are family. And that family was much larger, much bigger than it is today with the extended families as people get married. And of course, there's an Islamic dimension to this. Islam recognizes these types of relationships. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala presents this as a sign, as a miracle, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala extends our families not only through blood. The Holy Quran says, وَجَعَلَ مِنْهُ نَسَبًا وَصِهْرًا. The relationships that you have with other people in this world, these close relationships, these family ties, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, some of them are blood relations. You share the same blood. And some of them are, today we call them your in-laws. These are relationships that grow sihra. That's what it means. It's musahara. That through a relationship of marriage, that family extends and grows. And this has very deep repercussions on how societies get arranged and are organized and so on and so forth. And of course, this has a direct impact on the community. And when you include the dimension of the extended family in the discussion of upbringing, this means that, as opposed to what we have today, which almost goes without saying in a lot of cases for us, where we view the main responsibility, in fact the entirety of the responsibility in some cases, of raising these children entirely on two adults, the father and the mother. In the extended family, there are many others, mainly usually adults, but not always only, not exclusively, many others who are feeling, growing up, they have a deeply felt sense of duty towards these children because they grow up in that type of household. They may be cousins, they may be siblings, they may be relatives through marriage, the extended family. There are perhaps other adults or other people in general in that household and in that extended family that will be responsible or feel a duty and responsibility towards every member of that family, including the children. And this, of course, goes both ways, but there's certainly an advantage, less of a burden and less of a pressure of only having two people having to care for those children when you have many, many more contributing to that. It could be 2, 3, 4, 5, or more people contributing to that. That's a completely different way of seeing things, and Inshallah, we'll come back to this point a little bit later. I don't know if it's today or next time, but this is an important point. And so all of this generated a much more solid sense of identity, a lot more shared values because you grew up in that type of environment, a lot more connections to nature, and a lot more connections in ways to human beings to help understand ourselves. And all of this today is either entirely lost or lost in large parts. So today we move into new times and new social and other realities, which means that in a lot of cases, and we hear a lot about this, that because it's a new world, because it's a new reality, perhaps the parenting that worked in the past is not going to work as is today. Which means that we have to take a closer look at what it means to parent, to be a parent in this type of environment, and produce kids who become individuals in society, who are able to adapt and overcome and still be good human beings in spite of everything that we just described going on in society. All these transitions happening in society. I think it is well known for Muslims, as these are very well known principles and many of them stemming from a hadith. For instance, not to raise your children in the way that you were raised because they were created at a time that is different or in a generation that is different than yours. And I have talked about this hadith on both sides of the past. The obvious part is that, of course, this is a different world and it requires to adapt. And so the so what from this is simply that we have to know, therefore, what has to remain the same, what is the timeless, universal, eternal truth that has to be the same, and what part has to be the part that constantly adapts and changes depending on the social and other realities of the world. This is the key here. The second point, and it's perhaps secondary, and this is what I have talked about in the past, is that it is not necessary that everything your parents were doing were correct, and it does not necessarily mean that everything that they were doing is incorrect. This cannot become the pretext that, well, my parents did that, but what did they know? This was, this would be necessarily a regressive way of thinking. There is a tremendous amount of good in the traditional way of doing things that could too easily be dismissed and too easily be lost by using this as a pretext. That they were created, now we are in a different world, and therefore we let go of everything that we could be inheriting from the past. No, not everything. We have to examine what needs to stay, what needs to go, what needs to stay, but perhaps in a different way. Okay? And this is another issue that arises from all of this, therefore the importance of education of the parents and knowledge of the parents to understand this. On the world side, to have that type of awareness of what is happening in the world, and on the religious side, what stays and what changes religiously when times change, when society changes, when things are in transition as they are today. In any case, so today there is no doubt that we have to do more for parenting. There is no doubt that perhaps the risks are greater than they were before, that there is greater complexity, things are moving at a faster pace, and the changes are more deep and more meaningful, more significant, and so they require more drastic solutions and more drastic approaches and strategies. For many of us, it could also mean that we are living in societies that are completely different. These are not the societies in which our parents grew up, perhaps, or our grandparents or previous generations may have grown up in societies where they have existed for generations upon generations or centuries upon centuries. This is a very different reality than being in a society where you feel like you have immigrated and you are now a first or second or third generation society or community within that society. So all of that to say, when we keep all of this in mind, and we perhaps, I think, clearly identified this as one of the realities in today's time, is that there's a general discouragement or constant questioning of even the idea of getting married and establishing and starting a family in today's world. Everything is going against that idea of simply and automatically thinking that you reach a certain age and the time should therefore be to find yourself a partner and start your life and start therefore your family life, your own family life. So when we start turning to Islamic teachings, what does it say about all of this? So Islamically speaking, and again, because this is not the time to go through this theme in detail, inshallah, we will go through this theme of the family in Islam a little bit later in the series, and we will present the detailed version of this discussion. This is simply to touch very high-level overview points and principles as they are relevant to this discussion specifically. Islam directly encourages to get married. And so this is where we start to see that there is a difference between following Islamic teachings and simply allowing ourselves to be followers of or taken over by the current of today's culture. Islamically, there is a strong encouragement to get married. And there is a strong encouragement to have children. And in fact, there is even an encouragement to have many children. So we can reinterpret this, we can look at it, we can adapt it to times, but the truth is, if we go back to the narrations, these are very clear indications, and inshallah later we will go through these ahadith. So this is the first point. Now, we're moving towards the child coming into this world and knowing what we do. So already we have been encouraged to get these children into this world. That's one. Two, there's a lot of warning in our religion about making sure that, I'm going to say it in a strange way, that the right children are coming into this world. That the children and the human beings that we are bringing into this world are going to be good human beings, as opposed to evil human beings. This is very clear in the narrations, in the verses of the Holy Quran. There is absolutely no doubt that there is an insistence, there is an encouragement, whether it's through prayer, through action, there is a warning. And we have to therefore take concrete steps to make sure that the children that we are bringing into this world do not become evil human beings, bad human beings. And all sorts of precautions and all sorts of ingredients and factors have therefore been mentioned to help us avoid bringing people into this world who will become evil human beings, bad human beings. So on the one side, our religion is telling us, bring people into this world, but make sure that they are going to be good people. So already we're starting to see that there is a very clear direction and guidance provided by our religion around these issues, these topics of the family. There's an importance that has been mentioned through the verses of the Holy Quran, through many of the narrations, and there's too much to list now, inshallah. We'll go through a lot of the samples later. For instance, in the prayers, to pray for having good descendants and a good progeny in general. That it's not only my children today that are going to become good human beings tomorrow. It's that 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 10 and 50 and 100 generations down the road, down the line, those are all going to be good human beings. Human beings who are productive, who are contributing to what is good in the world, who are producing good in the world. There's an insistence on these points in our religion. And this, for someone who is aware of this, who believes in this, this becomes a very important point that allows you, that helps you make decisions in your life. It's no longer about you as an individual. You're not an isolated individual that happens at a point in time and disappears, even though you are. But this way of thinking forces you to see yourself as part of a much greater line, continuity. Whether you like it or not, whether you realize it or not, you are contributing. You are bringing a whole line of human beings in one direction or another. You therefore have to take certain precautions and act in a certain way, because whether you realize it or not, whether you feel like it or not, you are responsible for, to a large extent, to a certain extent, you are responsible for the direction that that line of descendants is going to take, where it's going to go. Beyond this, now we start to look at the teachings related to children and upbringing in Islam. Islam doesn't start there. Islam starts all the way to the choice of the spouse. If you want to see what Islam says about how to raise your children, and you follow the hadith, they bring you all the way back to who did you choose as a spouse. And then that is going to create a whole domino effect, and then we will eventually get to, and this is how you are going to raise the child. That child is not coming out of nowhere. There's a spouse selection that is going to be very meaningful in the type of human being you're bringing into this world, and the role that this spouse is going to play with you to raise that child. And this is very clear in Islam. And this is mentioned in this line of thinking. This is not us indirectly connecting dots and trying to create something where there is nothing. Islam says when you start thinking about how to raise your children, start before the child is born, start before the person has even entered your life as a spouse, so that you are choosing wisely. You are choosing based on the right criteria. You're looking at the right indicators for that person. And here, our religion has emphasized a number of them, and each one of these, inshallah, we will discuss at length much later. First and foremost, we should be looking for the religious traits. For someone who actually has this type of awareness, and who cares, who's a believer, who wants to do this as a sense of, out of a sense of duty, responsibility, you want to bring the right people into the world, and you want to think down the line about the descendants that you are creating and the direction you're putting them on, then the discussion should start with the religious traits of the spouse. That's one. Beyond that, the moral traits. And here, there's a whole discussion about this too, and Islam has talked about some of these traits specifically. I'm skipping the detailed discussion. There is importance in Islam. There is a recognition in Islam that has been given to traits that are sometimes dismissed within our communities, unfortunately. But Islam has recognized that these traits are not to be dismissed. They do carry a certain amount of meaning. There are cultural considerations. There are socio-economic considerations. You need to be with someone where there is enough compatibility at these levels so that you can create a family. Sometimes that itself becomes a hurdle for those two people to be able to create a community and a family that contributes to that community. Islam has said enough, I'm not going to say a lot, but has said enough about hereditary traits. And again, this is perhaps not something we always think about as being a religious topic, but it is. In fact, this is a whole discussion that inshallah we'll leave to another time, that our religion perhaps spoke about the importance of hereditary traits much, much earlier than this idea came into the general culture and understanding, as we find, for instance, in the West, with the idea of heredity and what is passed down through genes and what that means. Islam spoke about all of this in different ways, but anyone who reads these, anyone who hears about them understands that there's no ambiguity here. that Islam has spoken directly about the importance of looking at the heredity or the hereditary traits of the person that you want to take as a spouse, a father or a mother for your children. In the case of choosing a wife, for instance, Islam is very clear. It says, in a lot of ways, the traits that the woman is going to pass down to the child in her womb, you can find many examples of them, very good examples of the traits that will be passed down through her, because there are two people contributing. But on her side, many of those traits, Islam says, look at her brothers and sisters very clearly. Or it talks, for instance, there's too much to discuss here, and this is perhaps, I don't want to call it controversial, but this is certainly not something that I have seen elsewhere, and I'm a very big proponent of this, that I think the Islamic theory around heredity goes way beyond what genetics say today. Because biologically speaking, the genes are supposed to reflect something that is predetermined and kind of unchanging. You're stuck with what is in your genes, and that gives kind of the genetic potential, biological potential in which you can work. This is the body you're given, and that body is controlled, is written by a code, and that code is your genes. And you're stuck with this, and it's kind of predetermined. If you examine closely Islamic texts, you see that I'm going to call it the Islamic theory or the Islamic teachings around these hereditary traits, they go beyond what would be accepted today as falling in your genetic predisposition. Because it talks about traits that are usually, in a certain way, we can say that they are genetic. But those traits are certainly traits that you can modify. Islam talks about intelligence. Islam talks about bravery. Islam talks about someone who has good manners, to make the point even clearer. So, are you saying that you are born with good manners or not? Well, in a certain way, yes. Because a part of this is being passed down to you through your heredity, through what you have inherited from your parents. There is a part of this, yes, we may say that it is hereditary, but a part of this is certainly something that you can modify. And if you modify it enough, perhaps it becomes a part of you and it affects your genes. And then this is going to affect the next generations, which today's genetic theory does not talk about. So this would be, I'm calling this controversial, because this is my understanding of what Islam is saying about these hereditary traits. And there are too many indications of this in the teachings of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam to ignore, something to discuss perhaps in the future. And then we move to general indications that we find in Islam about upbringing. Some of these are about the general approach and methodology to be used when you parent. So for instance, there's an importance given to beauty. Now, beauty, when you raise a child, it could mean, and it does in certain situations, it means the external beauty of the child. Islam says there is nothing wrong, in fact, it's encouraged to raise the child from birth. You want the child to be as beautiful as possible. It encourages to give birth to children who are beautiful in the world and to beautify the child with all sorts of ways and things that we all know, culturally speaking, that are done to beautify a child. That's all there. But as part of that, and this is something to keep in mind as we parent, as we raise our children, is that as the child grows and you take care of them and the child learns that it is important to give importance to the external beauty, Islam says, and also you're also teaching about the internal beauty, the inner beauty, the balancing between the beauty of your soul and who you truly are and your external physical appearance. So that's a general part of the approach to parenting in Islam. And this applies to everything. This could be applied in a very practical, concrete way to, I feel like having so-and-so thing. I want you to buy me, as a child, I want you to buy me that shoe, that pair of shoes. I want to get that toy. I want to get that object. And in a lot of ways, this is because of the appearance of that object and the cultural significance of that appearance. And Islam says there is a recognition of that dimension. This is not something to just be dismissed. Islam is too realistic and too pragmatic. It recognizes all of these layers. It's too nuanced and subtle that it can recognize all of this. We don't just dismiss. Things are not just black and white. Yes and no. There's a lot of gray that is recognized in our religion. But everything is balanced. And it's balanced against what really matters. There is a material world in which we live. And there's a human psychology, and it has an effect on this human psychology. Everything that we see and the manner in which things are presented in this world. But there's also a spiritual dimension. And this, and inshallah I'm going to come back to it a little bit later, therefore, the importance of modeling this behavior. You want to teach especially about the inner beauty, you have to be able to model this inner beauty to the child. And this is part of the general approach to raising children. The importance of role models. And this is another extremely important point that our religion has put into application before teaching us in theory about it. Our religion didn't necessarily say it is important for a human being to have role models. It didn't present things that way. It just said, if you have the proper intelligence and the proper beliefs, then you follow the Holy Prophet. You have a specimen that God has sent you. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has engineered and structured the world in this way, so that He is the one who has given you the role models to follow. So He says, I'm going to send you messengers and prophets who are not angels, the Quran says, so that they are enough like you so that you can consider them naturally as your role models. And the same thing with parents. When you wake up into this world, when you open your eyes and you start being aware in this world, your role models are your parents. No one else. Your first role model is your father and your mother. And then other people. And it is part of your responsibility as a parent to make sure to know and to put in place the role models of your children. That's a second important approach and methodology in our religion. The importance that our religion gives to companions and friends. Who is it that is influencing the child? In what way? What do they bring into their lives? The good and the bad. You have to know. And you play a role and you're responsible for this. Belief and action. And there's so much to say here, because this is what becomes basically the curriculum of raising children. Everything that falls under what should the children believe in, our entire system of beliefs, and our entire system of conduct, the applied version of our religion. What is it that the child is supposed to do at every step in their lives? And here, there is an approach in our religion. It's very clear in our religion that the teachings are not just dumped on the person, including the child, in a way for them to simply follow them blindly. The teachings have to be presented in a way that is convincing, that answers their questions, that aligns with their sense of curiosity. You don't burden the child with things that are irrelevant to them. If this is not something that the person has questions about, why are you injecting those questions in their minds and then trying to answer those questions? Why are you creating a doubt and then trying to resolve the doubt? You have to take care of all of this as you raise a child. So there is a balancing act between what is based on reason and what is based on instinct. And there's a lot of recognition in our religion that we have good instincts. Human beings are born with good instincts, with right instincts. And until that instinct is distorted, you can rely on that instinct. If things are going well and the instinct is good enough to keep you a good human being, there is nothing wrong with that. And then for belief and action, you have to take into consideration what is most effective and what is most efficient. Effective as in you are producing the greatest impact. The greatest impact to be good. This is what you should focus on. And you want to be efficient in the least amount of energy and time and effort. You want to produce the greatest impact. Not everything can be covered. Not everything can be done. Not everything can be learned. Not everything can be mastered. So what is it that is going to be the most effective? This is how you teach. This is how you bring up a child. At every point in time and every day in their life, you have to think, what is the most effective for this child's life today? And what is the most efficient? For the amount of energy and time and effort that you have and that the child is willing to put in. What is going to be the most effective? Where do I put my energy and the child's energy? Do I teach them about history? Do I teach them about the Quran? Do I teach them about beliefs? Is there a certain order and a logic to be followed so that these things fall into place? All of this needs to be balanced with the rest of life. And I'm not going to talk about more than that for now. Because many parents will care a lot more, for instance, about academics. And other parents will care a lot more about athleticism. And other parents will care about, can my child play the piano or another musical instrument, for instance, or whatever other skill and knowledge and expertise that the child is being directed towards, because the parents think that this is going to be in their greater good, for their greater good, and their greater interest. There is clearly in our religion an emphasis on what we can call a theological education. So this is not something that is open for negotiation. This is one of the staples in our religion, that the child has to be given a proper education so that they know enough of what they're supposed to believe and why they believe what they believe. Now that minimum can change. What is the acceptable minimum education, minimal theological education that the child should have? Theological as in my belief in God, my belief in religion in general, my belief in prophethood, my belief in the afterlife, my belief in death, and so on and so forth. These things have to be part of the necessary curriculum that the child goes through. Now the minimal threshold is going to change. It's going to change based on you as a parent and your understanding of today's world. So it's going to change based on the society in which you live, what the child is going to be exposed to, and what you deem to be sufficient for the child to be protected and immune and ready to enter into the world. It's going to change based on the child. Not every child can learn the same things at the same pace, at the same time, at the same way. All of this is part of the equation. And then the resources that you have. And inshallah, we're going to come to this point a little bit later. There is no expectation that you are going to be the expert in all of this. So what resources are you going to make available so that the child is at least acquiring the minimal threshold? It does not necessarily need to be you as a father or a mother. Your job is to make sure that this is granted to the child. However this is done, it's up to you. You have to make sure that you can check off this box and say, I performed my duty with this in the best way I could. Ritualistic education is important. Later, we need to rebalance. And so if the balancing is happening right at the time of raising the child, that's great. Usually in our communities, there's a lot more balancing that has to happen later. We have to see. There are people who are way too far into the ritualistic aspect of religion. And so to them, religion has simply become a series of mechanical, blind rituals to be followed. But they don't carry any meaning. They have no impact on them. You feel nothing when you perform it. Whatever the ritual may be. from praying to fasting to performing pilgrimage to any other ritual in religion. And on the other side, sometimes we go too far on the spiritualistic aspect of religion, and then we forget about rituals. And we forget that our religion wants us to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through these rituals. Only that these rituals have to have meaning. We have to understand what those meanings are. So I should not be creating rituals for myself. I should be finding the meaning in the rituals that my religion has given me. And this is a balancing act which has to start as early as possible. And that's why a religion, for instance, is going to say, you teach the children how to pray. And you hit a certain age, it's expected that you're always performing your prayer. In any case. So this is the balancing that needs to happen between the ritualistic education and the spiritualistic dimension to it. The importance of self-reflection, the importance of our outer and inner akhlaq. And we have to combine that with goodness. So let's call this the goodness, inward goodness, goodness towards the self, and goodness towards others. You have to go out of your way to make sure that the child is learning about being good to other human beings, being good in society, producing good in the world in general. And of course, all of this comes down to, if we want to be the most effective, teaching by example, parenting by example. It's one way to sit and lecture. It's another for the child to simply see these things in action and learn from them. This is ingrained much deeper into the human being and stays with them much more in life when they saw their parents do this. When you see your father performing a ritual act, an act of worship, reciting Quran, performing a prayer, going to the mosque, giving the sadaqah, helping someone on the street, this stays much more with you in life and affects you much more deeply than someone sitting with you and explaining things with words. And it stays theoretical, but you never see the application of it in life. Continuing with parenting principles now. In Islam, and these are a few, I'm simply highlighting the main ones that you find in the ahadith or the ones around which there are more ahadith. The principle of fairness and I'm going to call it equality / equity between siblings. So that siblings never really feel like one of them is much more liked than another. Your duty is to do as best you can. In some cases, the child will still feel bad. And a case in point, go back to Surah Yusuf alayhi salam in the Holy Quran, and you see that the brothers felt like Yusuf alayhi salam is much more dear and much more beloved to his father than they are. And as a result, creates jealousy, and the rest of the story ensues. And this was a prophet. We know that this is not a shortcoming on his side. He's not displaying too little affection, for instance, to the brethren. But to them, this still affected them in this way. So in any case, and I say equity because clearly in the ahadith, there is tafdeel. There is a preference given to girls. There is a precedence given to girls. If you have girls and boys as your children, that you always start with the girls when you have gifts and so on and so forth. This is a very clearly established teaching in our religion. In any case, the tailored gradual progression. This is another parenting principle. In that you do not go at your own pace with the child. You go at the pace of the child. And everything is taught gradually. You progress towards the highest level from the lowest level. And this has to be tailored to the child. Not every child can learn everything in the same way, at the same pace, and so on and so forth. So tailoring is required, and the progression and the gradual learning or teaching is required as well. As part of the parenting principles, initiating training You do not wait and only react as you see shortcomings and issues and things that require rectifying from your child to intervene. You have to be proactive and to initiate. And this is also mentioned explicitly in the narrations. That you start by teaching your children. Don't wait. As soon as you see readiness, as soon as you see that there is potential, there's enough maturity, there's enough understanding for the child to learn, now you have to move into action and start that teaching. So it's not reactive and it's not passive. You're not staying indifferent and neutral and not doing anything. That would be passive. Better than that would be you see an issue, you intervene. That would be reactive. Our religion wants you to be proactive. Before anything happens, as soon as you see that now this child can take on some of this learning, then you have to start engaging in that way. The importance of catching what's right. Children do a lot of right and they do a lot of wrong. That's part of being a child. That's how you learn. You have to catch as much of the right as you can. And this is a general upbringing principle and goes way beyond human beings. When you train, when you teach, you catch what's right and you reward what's right. More than you catch what's wrong and you punish what's wrong. This one would require a much lengthier discussion. Firmness and tenderness. That the child knows that the parents are firm, but tender and affectionate and merciful and loving, but firm and rigorous. There has to be enough firmness that the child feels that there is parenting and there are boundaries and there are red lines and they are clear to the child. And they're not going to get it right the first time or the second or the third or the 10th or the 100th or the millionth. That there will always be another chance, yes. So there is firmness in tenderness and in love and in affection. And this brings to the whole discussion another one that would require much lengthier discussion around discipline. Discipline is part of Islamic teachings. You have to be able, there are extensive chapters, whether it's in Islamic law or elsewhere in Islamic disciplines, about disciplining children. Disciplining in general and disciplining children specifically. Okay, so this is definitely part of Islamic teachings. Islam recognizes that discipline is required. Not everything needs to be spelled out. Not everything needs to be caught. Not everything needs to be disciplined, but discipline does exist. Discipline cannot completely break all the aspects of respect and dignity and integrity of the child either. Right? And this is a very important principle in Islam. So nothing that breaks the personality of the child, nothing that leads to the degradation or the condescension in the presence or the absence, nothing that frightens excessively the child. All of these things have been mentioned in Islamic teachings. And then being careful from what we can call excessive attention. And attention can be negative or it can be positive. So to be there all the time watching everything the child does is not good in general. Even if you turn that into a positive. Even if that attention is, it always leads to good and it always leads to positive things and positive experiences. This is too much attention that the child is experiencing. This is not good for them. It doesn't help become the good, full, autonomous human being they need to become later. And the opposite, I think, is very obvious. To be on their case all the time about everything is also unhealthy, okay, and leads to harmful effects. The other way of looking at all of this is to focus on what in Islam we can call the rights of the child in Islam. So these could be directly about your own child, or it could be about children in general. And entire volumes have been written about this topic in Islam. The rights of children in Islam. And we can do this about many other agents in society, people in society. Children have been singled out in a lot of literature, in Islamic literature. I thought I would highlight a few. And again, for this discussion, perhaps a lot easier to do it based on the stages of the development of the child as opposed to looking at other aspects of the child. The first one I would highlight is the right to life. And in our religion, life is sacred. And that's the first right. And in today's world, I think that it is important to talk about the right to life of the child. Perhaps here, I'll talk about this in more detail later. Islam celebrates every birth. And there are a lot of rituals around the birth of a child. Right before the birth, during the birth, right after the birth, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 7 days, 10 days, 40 days after the birth of the child. There are many rituals mentioned. All of this is part of how Islam encourages to celebrate every birth. It's to be recognized, it's to be celebrated. This is attention given to that newborn and everybody around it and the mother and so on and so forth. In any case. Secondly, I call this the right to childhood as a general theme. The child is allowed to be a child, to grow up, to come into this world and fully experience childhood. And this, therefore, can be separated into many smaller components or subsections or headings. For instance, the child has a right to a proper physical development. Today they would say, for instance, that you're allowed to, or it is a right of yours, of every human being, including the child, for health. This is part of your rights as a child, to be healthy and to be put in a situation where you are growing up in a healthy way. The right for safety, physical safety here, but it goes beyond. There's a psychological dimension to this as well. The right for protection. All of this falls under the rights of the childhood. There's a whole discussion that we're not going to have now around specifically the feeding of the child. And Islam has said a lot about this. In the Holy Quran, there are indications. In the Hadith, there are many, many more about the importance of breastfeeding specifically and everything around it. The ahkam, the circumstances, the details, a lot of this has been explained and discussed. The highlights to me that I would simply mention right now is this is mentioned as a right of the child. Specifically in this way. This is the right of the child to be fed in this way by their mother. Okay? I simply say it that way. There's more to be said. I'm simply saying it at a high level. There's a lot of details to be added here and context that can change the situation and so on and so forth. But in short, the natural, general Islamic teaching is that this is a right of the child. Next, the characteristics of the person performing this feeding to the child. And Islam says very clearly that the traits of this person are passed down to the child through the milk in this explicit way. Whether Islam says physically through the milk or through the act of feeding the child and the proximity and the constant presence of this person in their lives, these are moral traits that are being passed down to the child. Therefore, the importance of the qualities and attributes of the person performing the feeding of the child. The hadith that clearly state that so long as it is possible, and by far the preference should be always for the mother to be performing this duty. Open bracket, which puts a lot of questions and question marks around the story that we generally hear about the life of the Holy Prophet ﷺ in childhood and so on and so forth. That this would not have been observed in the case of the Holy Prophet ﷺ, therefore would go against what Islam has taught, and we generally believe that this would have been observed for the Holy Prophet, given who his parents were, his family, his grandfather, and so on and so forth. So unless we can clearly establish the exceptional nature of those circumstances, there's a lot of question marks about that story, at least in the way that it is customarily presented. Close bracket. Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, when he talks about this, what I say, it's clearly a right. There's a hadith, Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, he uses these terms. He says, if the child is not fed 21 months, anything less is an injustice against the child. This is the wording that the Imam uses. And he says that there is no greater blessing for the child than the milk of his mother. Today it's very clear. Today we know the literature and the science and the studies, and this is 14 centuries ago in the middle of the desert where Islam was teaching this. And then Islam also spoke specifically about some of the things children are fed. It says, pay close attention to what you put in the mouth of a child. The importance of dates. From the time the child enters into the world, for instance, at the moment of birth, the Holy Prophet would take a tiny bit of and make the child taste dates at the time of their birth. Right? Or pomegranates, for instance, and how they are good for children for a number of different reasons. Or sawiq. And sometimes they came to Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam and they say, we feel like the child is weak. The Imam would say, why don't you feed him sawiq? Which is, today we would say it's a flour of either fenugreek or barley. Right? And so they would make, it's some sort of pudding that is made of these substances. So cereals in general and fenugreek, and today these are considered superfoods, especially around pregnancy and birth and so on and so forth. In any case, these are mentioned explicitly in our narrations. Beyond that, we're still talking about the rights of the child, the proper intellectual development of the child. This is one of the rights, that the child is allowed to grow intellectually based on their potential, based on being granted enough opportunity to achieve that potential. That's all I'll say for this one. The importance of, and we see this is where Islam emphasized, and the reason why Islam emphasizes in most cases is that there was a social issue that it was trying to correct. So Islam emphasized a lot to provide children, as a right of the child, to provide children with sufficient effective development, that the child can grow up emotionally healthy. And the way to do that, and the main ingredient, is that the child feels enough love growing up, enough affection growing up. And this by itself is a long discussion that we would need to see how Islam addresses this issue and why it is so important. Okay, so Islam does not shy away, especially when the child enters into the world and in young age, does not shy away from showering the child, overwhelming the child with affection and with love, and with making the child feel safe and being given a lot of attention when the child is very young. And as the child grows up, you start to decrease that, and we'll talk about the next parts. And this is very clear. And it stays the case for life. It's just that it has to become appropriate for the circumstances and the child and what is needed. But especially in younger age. This is very important, and Islam makes a very big point to make this. And how the Holy Prophet ﷺ would remain in that state with Fatima al-Zahra alayhi salam until he left this world. He would always perform the same things he would do with her. If he enters into a room or she enters into a room, all the hadith say the first thing he does is give her a kiss on her forehead. And he makes her sit in his space, in his seat. This is an affection. Or how he would be around Imam al-Hasan, Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam in young age. And he left the world and they were still children. At the most, they would have been 7 and 5 or 7 and 6, around that age when he leaves this world. And so during this time, he would show so much attention to Imam al-Hasan, Imam al-Hussein, that a lot of the companions would come and ask questions, and why you're doing this, and why do you love them so much? Do you really love them that much? So we have to wonder, what are they seeing? What is the Holy Prophet? We're getting glimpses from the ahadith of what the Holy Prophet would do, how much he would carry them and kiss them and play with them and be affectionate towards them. And in response, the Holy Prophet would give multiple responses. And of course, the responses, we have to recognize that they are multi-layered, right? He's giving more than one layer in this answer when he says, for instance, whoever does not show mercy to them, so to children in general, or to Imam Hassan, Imam Hussein alayhi salam, whoever does not show mercy to them will not be shown mercy. Okay, but as part of this is also a general theory about how you're supposed to bring up your children. Okay, in a society where, we have to keep that in mind, in a society when all of this was not common. It was not common for men, and important men, and heads, and leaders, and men who lead other men into war and battle, to be this affectionate, and this tender, and this loving, especially towards children, and be surrounded by children. And this is well known in the life of the Holy Prophet ﷺ. Basically, the time that he lived in Medina, every single person who ever had a child born would bring them to the Holy Prophet ﷺ to receive his blessings and his prayers, and the Holy Prophet would perform it. And he would spend time with the children, he would salute children, he would play with children, and so on and so forth. This leads us to talk about the importance of play, entertainment in the life of a child. This is recognized. This is not only recognized, this is encouraged. And parents are instructed to play with their children, especially in young age. And there are too many reasons to list here of why they say this. This is not, simply for spending time because it's fun, because it's entertaining for the child to be doing a lot of this type of activity. This is how the child learns. This is how the child explores the world, understands the world. It's good for their intelligence. It's good for their motor skills. To the child, this is development. This is learning. You're simply adapting what you're teaching them, which means that this is not a completely aimless activity, right? And we can come back to this a little bit later. There's a lot more to say here. And depending on the way you play, you could also teach the child attention and focus. You can also teach the child about being patient, about being generous, about, from a very young age. The recognition of freedom and the genius of the child. Children are very witty, very smart, very intelligent, very creative. You have to give space to that as a child, to the child, so that it leads to creativity, it leads to innovation, it leads to starting to see some of the talents of the child, and this comes with the balancing act that you then have to ensure that you put in place later between freedom, because that's the only way to see what the potential is without too many restrictions, and the responsibility of the freedom I gave you. You are still accountable for the freedom that you're getting. Okay, so inshallah, this is something we can also talk about much later. And the right to what I called to childhood and purity of innocence. And this is important, and this is explicitly mentioned in Islamic teachings. That the child has a right to stay pure and innocent, especially as a child. And this is explicitly in relation to sexual education. And so, exposing the child before the readiness, very clearly mentioned, that we have to, warnings against, this leads to harmful repercussions. Protecting the child against distorted teachings, before the child has a critical mind to understand what they are being exposed to, before the mind is developed. The difference between, and this is where a lot of problems occur, the difference between educating and stimulating. There's a way to teach and to educate without overstimulating. This has to be observed. And so therefore, all of this has to be done within a very clear program. It has to be rigorous. It has to be closely monitored. It has to be done by people who are competent and they know what they're doing when all of this is being presented. And usually that's the parent who is best suited for this. But if it is not, at least you want to make sure that this is truly being done by people who are competent, qualified, as part of a clear program, as part of a clear curriculum, rigorously thought, well designed, and put in place. It's not random. It's not just complete freedom. Now it's time to teach, and we do anything and everything under the pretext that this is teaching. No, Islam does not accept that. And always it applies to here as it applies to everywhere. The difference between immunity that we're constantly trying to develop and over sheltering and over protecting to the point where there's a complete isolation or seclusion or too much innocence and too much naivete in the future that you don't even know what you are being exposed to when you should know. In any case, so I'll stop here for now. This deserves its own discussion. The importance of giving children responsibilities. Of course, in a way that is compatible with, that is relevant, that is effective, that is useful for that child. Okay, this is important, the gradual accountability of the child towards responsibilities and duties. Teach the child to be himself or herself as much as possible. And this is important. And unfortunately, especially when you are a minority, depending on the type of world you're growing up in as a parent, this is not always an easy thing to do, depending on your communities, your background, your history, what you've gone through in life, and so on and so forth. But generally speaking, the tendency to always want the children to be conforming, to conform with the masses, is not a healthy tendency. The child has to feel like they are, or they can be themselves. They can be a different individual. They can express their individuality, to be themselves. So long as a child has social awareness and emotional awareness, the child has to be able to be themselves. Examples of this. Some shyness is good. Some people complain that the child is too shy. Some shyness is good. Don't try to get rid of all the shyness. Islam encourages shyness, a lot in fact. Shyness is considered to be a good trait. You just have to be able to overcome it when it matters. For instance, confidence. We cannot exaggerate the role of confidence, especially if we know that you are going to be in situations where you are the minority, where you're singled out, where you're the only one who believes a certain thing or will have to do certain things. You have to have the confidence to back that up. Otherwise, you're going to crumble. You're going to fold. You're going to follow others just because you don't have the confidence to be yourself. So therefore, there are situations where standing out is good. And this comes with a lot of wisdom and a lot of maturity. So this has to be part of the general education of the child. Encourage the child to stand out. Learn to stand out in different aspects so that when the time comes to stand out in the things that matter, you are able to do so. And you know how to do it in the right way. The ability to speak out, the ability to be critical, the ability to question openly certain things. All really good traits. And you cannot criticize those traits and reduce them to the point where they completely disappear from the personality of the child. Then when you want them to have them, they are unable to display those traits. And this is where you have to be very careful. There's a lot more to cover. We're kind of out of time. I don't want to keep going the next couple of minutes, so I will stop here, inshallah, with the general principles, the general teachings of upbringing. The reason we are talking about all of this, once again, is not because we want to talk about what Islam says about family in general or about upbringing in general. As we said, it's because we believe that it is impossible to contribute as a family and to participate as a family in the community of knowledge unless you are able to grow up Islamically in that type of environment. And this is where the holistic aspect, we cannot talk about the Islamic family and the role that it plays in an Islamic community of knowledge without talking in general about what Islam says about an Islamic family and how you create that. And so the approach that we have taken, there's so much more that we can talk about, but the approach that we have taken in general is simply to follow the general development and evolution of a human being from childhood, and to look at different aspects of the teachings that Islam has put in place for that human being as they're going through the stages. And inshallah, we're headed towards the next stages in life. Okay, so generally speaking, that's the sequence of what we're presenting. And I received a lot of messages and a lot of questions, and that's why I'm providing a little bit more detail than I was initially intending to. There's a lot of interest and a lot of questions in these topics, because we all know that there is a huge amount of need to talk about these topics from an Islamic perspective, and to present the Islamic theory about the family and upbringing in a way that is compatible with today's world. So inshallah, we'll continue with this topic the next time we meet. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin.